I'd like to now welcome the first panel of the day for today. This panel will be discussing the elements of a national cybersecurity strategy. So how different countries are drafting up their strategy, implementing their strategy, and what are the key elements of doing so in the most effective way. This panel will be moderated by Melissa Hathaway. Once again, at the end of the panel, you have an opportunity to ask questions, but please just come to the mic, identify yourself, and try to stick to one question per person. Thank you. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everybody. I have the great honor, pleasure to be here again, and as I think a plank holder of this conference. And I have of working in the international sphere, and I have a fantastic panel representing a very global view from Asia to South America to Europe, and then an industry perspective. But after listening to Rob Joyce and Maricha, I thought I'd actually reset a context of kind of why we're talking about cybersecurity in the first place, and to set the context of this panel. And so the cybersecurity, the reason that we're having this conversation is because the information communications technology market is flourishing globally, and we're embedding this technology into everything that we do, from where we work, we live, and we play. And this ICT market represents a $3.5 trillion market, $3.5 trillion market for 2017 alone. And as we start to think about the next few years, as we connect into the Internet of Things, that's going to represent a $19 trillion market opportunity for our businesses selling these goods and services and, into the marketplace, representing information communications technology. And then over the next, between now and 2025, 7 years, it's going to represent a $32 trillion opportunity as we modernize our infrastructures. And today it represents 7% of global GDP. That's a lot. And our countries are putting this as part of the core to our digital agenda, because we see this as core to moving ourselves into this economic growth and opportunity. And that is why our governments are selling spectrum to allow you to continue to connect to the internet. It's why we're pushing a modernization of broadband to the last mile to allow our citizens to click, connect, and search anything and anywhere. And it's bringing about the efficiencies and productivities for our core companies. When I start to look at the future of the Internet of Things, I think of it of the connected citizen who now has this internet-connected device potentially medically embedded in them that now has to be removed because of its cybersecurity and its engineering flaws. St. Jude Medical is having to recall 400,000 pacemakers because of the poorly engineered product in the market for our connected citizens. Those connected citizens are going to have connected Fitbits, connected medical devices, and et cetera, and are going to be connected to other mobile devices in their houses and in their cars, et cetera. Our cars right now can connect to our transportation grids. Our mobile phones connect to our mobile cars become internet-connected devices. Those internet-connected devices now transmit into our internet-connected critical infrastructures. And those critical infrastructures actually share critical connected borders with other countries. So when I think about this, almost this box of connected citizen to connected house and connected other assets and connected houses to the connected infrastructures and connected infrastructures within these connected societies, I start to wonder who's architecting for the future, and how are we thinking about that Internet of Things from a safety perspective, from a privacy perspective, from a resilience perspective. And unfortunately, not many of our countries are thinking about that. And it's just now beginning to be part of that cybersecurity agenda or national security agenda. When you start to think about that cyber readiness and what does it mean to be prepared, I've been working on this for the last 5 years of thinking about how does one align that digital agenda, the economic growth, and the desire to connect anything and everything with the security agenda of how are you going to build the resilience in and ensure citizen safety, security, your sovereignty, and that global order of things, as Maricha spoke to. There's 7 areas that I've been looking at from Cyber Readiness Index, from strategy to incident response to law enforcement and legal capacity, information sharing, the investing in research and development and architecting for that future, anticipating that Internet of Things, and then thinking through the diplomacy and trade, and then truly your sovereign crisis response when you have a bad day, like Rob Joyce spoke about this morning. I am joined here by colleagues from China and Poland and Colombia and the private sector, and they're going to talk to us about how they're preparing for and responding to these cyber risks that are presented by 2 markets. One, an information communications technology market that's flourishing, that we're supporting, that's delivering us some challenging products in the market. And then a second market that's being driven to try to fix the first. And then how are we as countries actually thinking about that as we continue to push for our digital agendas and that economic opportunity that this information communications technology supposedly affords us. I'm going to start with Dr. Liu from China. Everybody can read these different bios. I had the opportunity to meet him last year. He's at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, and he's been leading lots of the thinking in China on their new cyber strategy, some of their laws, and as a thought leader in China, I'm hoping that he will give us an overview a little bit of the Cyberspace Administration of China and their views on the new strategy, the new laws, and how China is preparing. Please, Dr. Liu, thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for your introduction, and thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to this amazing conference. And today, I'm going to talk something like China's cybersecurity strategy from 3 basic elements. First is perception, second is missions, and third is challenges. And before 2013, the cybersecurity is the people's perceived in China as isolated into different categories, like the internet security, network security, information security, and information warfare. Each of these different categories, you have different government bodies in charge of. There's not too much coordination and interactions among these government agencies. So this model doesn't work when we have the new cyber threat posed by the Snowden case, the Stuxnet. So then the cybersecurity become the top agenda of our senior leader, and the state become our leading actor in cybersecurity. So in February 2014, the leading group on internet security and informationization has been established, and President Xi Jinping is the head of this organization, and also the Cyberspace Administration of China has been created as our operational body of the leading group. So this event case has a significant impact on China's perception towards cybersecurity. And after that, I believe that China turned to have a more comprehensive perception towards cybersecurity. And cybersecurity becomes the nexus of the national security, political security, economic security, and social security, everything. And cyber become a very popular prefix in China. People like to talk about the cyberspace, cybersecurity, cyber sovereignty, cyber terrorist, everything. But most time people, probably it's hard for them to understand what that means. I still remember we have been engaged with a lot of the track 2 dialogues with the US and the Europe. People always ask the Chinese government officials, what do you mean of cyber sovereignty? It's really hard for them to figure it out. But in last strategy, they formulate our definition of cyberspace sovereignty. And the change of their perceptions also means the change of their missions. And CAC undertake the responsibility to develop or design our cybersecurity strategy for the whole country, which including the lawmaking, the regulations, and the standard. The CAC mission, on the one hand, they want to create 4-dimensional approaches to protect national cybersecurity. On the other hand, it wants to create our ecosystem, cybersecurity ecosystem, to promote the public-private partnership and raise the awareness of their users, and as well as education and training. So, but the CAC's job, CAC is a new organization. Its work overlapped with some other government agencies, which may have traditional view on the cybersecurity. So it's hard for CAC to coordinate different government agencies. Sometimes CAC turn to do it by themselves, but it got a strong pushback force. So this is the first challenge. The second challenge is CAC did a lot of things in the past 2 years to establish the law, regulation, standard. This is to protect the response to the security request. But on the other hand, you need to balance the cybersecurity and the development or opening policy, which is a broader national strategy since for the past 35 years. China's economy relied a lot on their opening and the reforming policies. So CAC definitely need to benefit this. And what CAC has been done in the past has been draw a lot of the critic sides from their foreign companies, foreign government. But I don't think this is the only problem China faces. I think a lot of countries face the same problem, how you balance the cybersecurity and the development. And even here in the US, you have how to protect cybersecurity, how to protect people's privacy. This is all you need to balance. So lastly, I think there are a lot of things we can do probably through the international cooperation and to reduce the pressures, because there are a lot of pressures from outside. If the country can cooperate with each other, it can reduce the pressure from the government and let them focus on their digital economy and economic development, which probably this is the next panel. You have next panel on the norms cooperation. Probably they were going to do that. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. I'm going to circle back and come back to questions on some of the scenarios or key threats that that you and China are worried about. I'm going to move now to Joanna. I can't pronounce your last name, so I'm going to just call it Dr. Joanna from Poland. So everybody, please bear with me. She's a program director at the European Cybersecurity Forum in Poland, and I had the opportunity to spend some time in Krakow in Poland last year. They have a conference coming up in October. I highly recommend it. Americans, I think, would have a great, and everybody else should go see Poland. It's a wonderful country. But Poland, as many of you know, or some of you might know, Poland has a draft cybersecurity strategy. It was drafted last February of 2016, but it's still in holding pattern. The Ministry of Digital Affairs is actually leading the cybersecurity initiatives for their all-of-government approach in Poland. And Joanna has been instrumental in helping from behind the scenes from her think tank and institute. And I'm hoping, Joanna, that you can help everybody understand where is Poland right now in trying to prepare for and respond to cyber risks from that strategy perspective and the threats that you're worried about from your position in the world. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Melissa. I just want to say that I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing my last name in a correct way, so no worries about that. Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by saying that I'm extremely grateful for being here today. Thank you to the organizers, and it's a huge honor for me and for the Kosciuszko Institute that I represent to be here in Georgetown. So indeed, it has been a very long journey for Poland to prepare actually the first document that is called National Cybersecurity Strategy. The document was announced in March this year. It hasn't been adopted yet. we expect that it's going to be adopted very soon without major changes. And prior to this document, we had another one entitled Cyberspace Protection Policy of Poland, but it was a highly criticized document, and in general opinion, it did not fulfill strategic aims. So we are truly looking forward for this new strategy, hoping that it will strengthen our Polish cybersecurity ecosystem. Of course, due to the time constraints, I'm not able to provide you with all the details about the strategy, but I thought that maybe I will focus on the 6 most significant elements, because not only it should give you some overview over our Polish approach, but also, in my opinion, it reflects how the cybersecurity is approached in our part of Europe at the moment. So I will start with the first point, which is referring to the EU influence. And so the main goal of our new strategy is to enhance cybersecurity for private and public sector, as well as for citizens, in the area where so-called essential and digital services are provided. And if you look at a formulation of this main goal, you can strongly see that it is influenced by the European Union and the first EU law on cybersecurity, which is called NIS Directive. So, this is my first point. For many countries in Europe at the moment, how we approach to the cybersecurity is influenced by the EU guidelines, and this is very visible element. The second point is all about the coordination. We've heard a few seconds ago that this is extremely important element when we are talking about successful implementation of the national strategies, and this is the element that we are struggling with in Poland. To be honest, the ambition of the strategy is to establish something that we are calling national cybersecurity system, and to be honest, right now we are trying to figure it out which ministry or maybe even body should be responsible for the coordination of the system. And this is the hardest part of the whole process, in my opinion. And the third point is related to the economy. And I'm glad to say that for the first time, our new strategy clearly sees cyberspace and cybersecurity not only as a challenge, but also as a chance for our economy. And some of you might know that Polish is perceived as a country that is currently in something which is called middle income trap. And for our government, cybersecurity sector, cybersecurity market can be this driving force that will help us to move forward with our economy. So this is like a mission for the government right at the moment to strengthen this sector, this market, and to give a boost for our economy by developing these elements. So hopefully it can be our national specialization. And interesting fact is that we are putting a lot of emphasis on OT security systems, not only IT, so industrial control systems are strongly highlighted by the strategy. Fourth point relates to the increasing role of our armed forces in the cybersecurity ecosystem. You can clearly see that the strategy emphasizes the role of armed forces and calls to building and developing capabilities for them. So they will be able to conduct full spectrum of military activities in cyberspace, and this is the quote from the strategy actually. So, and when we are looking at the political decisions, the budget, we can clearly see that the role of our army is increasing, and to some extent this is in line with the requirements formulated after the NATO summit in Warsaw. Countries, member states are called to develop capabilities to be able to defend our networks, and to some extent I believe that this is in line with the NATO strategy. The next point is related to the importance of international dimension, and this is something that we are really proud of, because our institute strongly promoted the fact that Poland should be more active in the field of international relations when it comes to cyberspace and cybersecurity. And for the first time, this point is now included into the strategy, and it is one out of 4 main operational objectives, and we really hope there is going to be a turning point for our presence at the international area. And the last element, I mean, I thought that it might be interesting to you. It's not the main point of the document. However, I believe that it gives you some too interesting perspective on how the cyber threats are perceived in Poland. First of all, the document points out that cyber threats are more and more incorporated into hybrid strategies. And from our perspective, from Poland's perspective, only by looking at the experience in Ukraine, we are truly afraid that hybrid strategy with elements of cyber attacks can be the threat to our national security. And last but not least, internet is also seen as a tool that can be used to influence the society. In other words, it can be a part of so-called information warfare, and our strategy also sees that this threat is coming and might be also something that can lead to some severe consequences also for our society. So I'm going to stop here. In case of any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. That's really, really interesting. And I took notes on those 6 main thrusts. I have some more questions, but I'd like to move on to Mr. Chaves. I had the opportunity to meet with the Colombian delegation actually multiple times through here at the Organization of American States and then down in Uruguay for an OAS ministerial meeting. And Colombia is leading this from their Ministry of Defense and their cybersecurity initiatives, and they're looking at it from a national defense and risk management posture. So again, Colombia is taking it from a different perspective, and I'm hoping, Mr. Chaves, that you could talk to us about how Colombia is progressing on the strategy, the Ministry of Defense, and how you're coordinating the all of government of preparing Colombia to respond to these cyber risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to be in Georgetown speaking about the Colombian experience regarding cyber. Well, Colombia started to deal with the problem of cyber threats in 2007 when that process of building the national strategy started, focusing on cyber defense and cybersecurity. That's why the Ministry of Defense was responsible of the development of a national strategy in the first moment. This strategy was contained in a policy paper in Colombia we call COMPES. It's a document issued by the Council of Ministers. And it was a strategy with 3 outstanding pillars. The first one was the adoption of an appropriate institutional framework to coordinate, monitor, and generate recommendations in order to address and prevent threats and risks created by cyberspace. The second one was to provide training in information security and expand the research on cyber defense and cybersecurity. And the third one was to strengthen legislation on these issues, boost international cooperation and advance adherence to international instruments to fight cybercrime. Colombia created 4 groups in charge of developing these pillars. The first one was a commission responsible of the definition of the strategic vision of information management and of setting policy guidelines in technical infrastructure, public information, cybersecurity, and cyber defense. The second one was a national CERT, called CERT, within the Ministry of Defense, a joint cyber command in the General Command of the Military Forces in charge of cyber defense, in particular the protection of national critical assets, defense, sector threats and the identification of the nature of those threats. The fourth institution was a policy cyber center in charge of cybersecurity through information, support, and protection against cybercrime. The plan strategy met three basic goals. The first one was the improvement of technical capabilities by creating specialized units. The second one was pair and ensure the active participation of private stakeholders, in which the strengthening of the citizens' education and the improvement of all levels of prevention was paramount. And the third one was to affect criminal structures, cybercrime economy with global tracking through the linkage of national police to different international authorities. That one was the first step in the creation of a national policy. Then, in 2016, the Colombian government made a new document, a new policy document. Is a new national policy on digital security. That's a different approach of cybersecurity through a new document compass. This document embraces a digital security focus with a multi-stakeholder focus. This policy document articulates a strategic vision in which the outstanding stakeholders are compelled to responsibly use the digital environment and to strengthen their capacities to identify, handle, and mitigate the risk that digital security has. This document, this new version of the policy document, establish a four-year action plan starting in October 2016, and management indicators to evaluate the advances of the policy implementation. That's what can I say about the Colombian experience in the first step.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. The four-year action plan, I think, is important, especially to follow through on operationalization of the overall strategy. And then sort of it's interesting to redefine it in the digital security space. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Ehuan from a private sector perspective. He hails from the FBI and his much earlier career, but now working on and working with countries all around the world from a private sector initiative. And I asked him to kind of give it from, it's where you sit is what you see, and he sees a lot from where he sits because he's working with so many different countries on their particular initiatives. So please.
Right, thank you, and thank you for having me here. As I was formulating my thoughts this morning, and as I keep going out and meeting with individual companies and governments, and been doing this now for about 20 years, both started in the government sector with both the Air Force and the FBI, and now in the corporate sector for the past couple years, I see, unfortunately, the problem getting worse, not better. Melissa indicated the number of devices that the Internet of Things that are being placed on the Internet, and unfortunately I see a regime where companies are going out, getting technology, implementing technology into the infrastructure without a real understanding of what the implications are. And the implications are huge. You look at and I think we spoke about it this morning, the lack of international norms and legal frameworks, right? What I typically see when meeting and speaking with foreign law enforcement, especially law enforcement officials, the question always being asked is, you know, we see these crimes, they're either coming in from a different country, or we see the US being a nexus, and, you know, we need subpoena information from Google, for instance, or Microsoft, and we send these requests and we can't get this information, you know, can you help? And I think until those norms become formalized in some kind of manner, we're going to continue to have these problems. I see cyber criminals, and especially the organized crime groups, they don't worry about international laws and norms, right? They communicate very effectively. You've got hackers and organized crime groups throughout the globe operating with groups in the United States, and they don't care a whit about that there's a law that requires we go through a formal process to request information, for instance. They're obviously interested in monetizing the information that's being, either stolen or captured from a particular company. So that would be my first point. I think as we're looking at these cyber strategies that are being built within countries on a higher scale, I think internationally we need to look at formulating and implementing an international legal framework that allows government to share information more effectively and more efficiently. Secondly, when I see these cyber strategies and working with countries, there's a huge disconnect between what the government policies and strategies are saying and what private industry are doing. Perfect example, working with a Asian country right now. Recently implemented a cyber law. One of their critical infrastructure firms that we're working with just became aware that there was this cyber law that was recently passed and that they needed to implement certain safeguard regimes into their particular operations of this international company. The lawyers got a hold of the law. They sent out an email to the IT team saying, okay, kind of follow these things because it's the law. And as we're looking at them and as we're working with this company, we're kind of shocked. One, that there's obviously a disconnect between the government strategies, the government legal frameworks, and the private corporations. And this isn't just in this particular country. I mean, I see it throughout the world. There's the disconnect exists. It exists in this country as well. So I think until that disconnect somehow gets joined in a better and more efficient manner, we're going to continue to see these problems. So we can continue putting strategies, national strategies, and if we don't bring the private sector that, as we all know, own most of the critical infrastructure, it's just a piece of paper out there with really no impact or effect. Lastly, the other third big issue that I keep seeing is there is a huge deficit in training, awareness, education in the civil sector. Well, not only the civil sector, I see it in the government sector. Again, we keep bringing these devices online. We keep rushing this mad rush to put the latest and greatest technology online. Yet we haven't done a very effective job in educating both the user base, the civil base, in technology and the implications of this technology. And until that occurs, again, we're going to continue to have these problems. And interestingly enough, when I look at budgets, when we're, again, working with corporations all over the world, you look at the budgets for technology, very high budgets, right? Everybody wants the latest and greatest technology. You look at the training, the awareness, the education budget, tend to be very small, if it's even there. As long as that disconnect continues to exist, all of these strategies, all of these international frameworks are not going to have the impact that they really need to have. So those three, in my opinion, areas, until organizations, until countries, until private firms get a firm grasp on that, we're just going to continue chasing our tail, throwing money into technology, and being no better at securing our infrastructure than we were 20 years ago.
Thank you. I think that's a good segue into how our countries are thinking about our industries of national and economic importance. In the United States, we've actually identified 18 critical infrastructure sectors. And when you have 18, that means none of them are a priority. And so we need to actually start to look at how does one focus limited available resources, meaning people, time, and money, toward our most important problems. In the United States, I see three critical infrastructures. The first and foremost is energy. Without power, nothing else works. And our power grids are vulnerable, and they have pre-positioned weapons in them that can be detonated at a time and place of somebody's choosing. And we need to clean them up. We also have a telecommunication system that's increasingly becoming more fragile to distributed denial of service, as one could look at, from the DYN attacks in the United States, staged by two teenagers who brought down major businesses on the East Coast of the United States. And then thirdly, many of us are all focused and facing the challenges with the SWIFT network, which is the global interoperability of moving money between our banks, which has been penetrated, and there are dozens of banks that have lost millions of dollars. I worry about these critical infrastructures, and defining too many means that there's really none that are critical. So I'd like to understand from your particular countries, how are you defining the industries of national and economic importance? We, in some cases in the United States, through an executive order and President Obama, we called them the Section 9 authorities because they were Section 9 of the executive order. But they represented those companies that were X percent of our GDP or national critical importance. But how are we working with those companies, increasing their awareness or their defensive posture or their resilience or their continuity of business is a question that I have for my country, but I have a question the same way for yours. So I'm going to go back in the same order. Dr. Liu, China is looking at this in a very interesting perspective from the Cyberspace Administration, and some of the laws are beginning to try to reveal what you think are some of the most important industries, being IT delivering into government systems. Joanna, you talked a little bit about it from the European perspective, that the NIST directive, the Network and Information Systems Directive from the EU is defining it for many of the European countries, because you have to comply with the law and comport with that, which is 6 critical infrastructures, if I have that right. But then when you transpose that into your laws, how is Poland thinking about that, from big banks to little banks, big telcos to little telcos, and the like? And then, Mr. Alvarez, Mr. Chaves, I'm going to combine the two names together. There we go. How are you thinking about it from Colombia? Have you identified specific industries of national importance and that where the Ministry of Defense will actually cooperate? And then finally, from a private sector perspective, how are you seeing it, Art? Again, Dr. Liu, I'd like to start with China.
Okay, thank you, Melissa, for the question. I think critical infrastructure for China, we have our, a definition of what is the category of this critical infrastructure, like the banking, financial system, and the communication system, and the water system, electricity systems, and also the other system which have a strong, has related to the people's, significant damage, which is hard to translate. But which, from Chinese perspective, there are a lot of the private sectors now. We need to consider whether they will be defined as critical infrastructure, like some Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, these internet companies. They collect huge amount of the personal information, personal data, which much more than the government have. So when this company being hacked, the loss is much huger than some traditional, critical infrastructure. So, but it is hard to use the same critical infrastructure, with the government and in private sectors, because they have different interests. So for China, I think what is more important is the cybersecurity law mentioned, you have the critical infrastructure, how do you protect it? And you have the standard, which make more sense. It's compulsory standard. In China, it's been on the process of making. Then you will have more, those actors like the private sectors, government sector, foreign companies to get involved in that process, to bargain or to interact with each other, which one is critical infrastructure, how you need to do, what's the process of that. I think the cybersecurity law in China will be enforced in this June. And you need more time for that compulsory standard, but we will see. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna.
Okay, so currently there are two main groups of entities that are the most relevant in terms of cybersecurity in Poland. And the first group is called critical infrastructure operators, and this is something that already exists within our system, so to say. And the way how it works in Poland is that we have 11 sectors within which we try to identify and name operators of critical infrastructure. And they are identified under the very specific process where we take under consideration sectoral and cross-sectoral criteria, and then we try to figure out which operator can be named as the operator of critical infrastructure. And now as I mentioned, we expect to have also the group of entities called essential service providers. And to be honest, to some extent, these two groups will for sure overlap, but our government is trying to figure out how to identify the second group, the companies that will fall into this category. So, and I mean, it's not going to be an easy job. It's going to be difficult for our government, and and I know that they are currently trying to figure out how to do it in a good way, because this is, of course, the precondition of the overall success. But there is one interesting element that appears here, because at the moment our cooperation with critical infrastructure operators is built on voluntary basis. And this is something that exists since 2007 in Poland. And because of the European influence and because of the requirements that are expected to be in place as a consequence of NIS directive, we expect that we will shift towards more mandatory approach. And it's going to be a huge change for our system, because we will need to learn how to cooperate with the entities that are used to be more like partners, not so much as the object of the law and sanctions. But the last one sentence in this context is that this voluntary approach was rather criticized in Poland, even by the critical infrastructure operators themselves. They expect to have minimal requirements. They expect to have at least some kind of the guidance. So I believe that if we will be able to design the system in a good way, it might have good consequences on the overall landscape. But of course, besides of the critical infrastructure operators and essential service providers, there are all the rest of entities that exist, and our government plan to prepare non-binding good practices and recommendations for them, how to increase cybersecurity and cooperate on a more flexible manner, so to say.
Thank you. You know, the guidance and the minimum standard of care is emerging all around the world. And it's interesting when you start to think about each country is taking their own initiative and starting to make us less interoperable as global corporations in the world order, because each country is approaching this very differently. Joanna?
Yeah, but of course that's a huge threat. But I just want to underline that European Union sees this threat, and they are trying to harmonize the approaches among the member states and try to find one coherent approach and try to identify these minimal standards altogether, so it is not going to be different in every country.
I think that's going to be super important. Speaking as an American and a corporation trying to do business all around the world, I look at the regulations that are happening here that are inconsistent with the regulations in Europe that are making us all. It's very difficult to do business as a global business anymore. But then I don't know anything about what's going on in Colombia in this particular area, so I look forward to hearing what's going on in Colombia.
Well, I want to start saying why the Ministry of Defense is responsible for cyber. Maybe the institution, the national institution with most experience in cyber matters is the National Police, and the National Police is under the Ministry of Defense. That's why the decision of the government was to start that capacity building in the Ministry of Defense, because the Colombian Police has that higher knowledge of the matter. In Colombia, the critical cyber infrastructure is largely owned by the private sector, and coordination work has become a strategic issue. The Ministry of Defense is probably the most recognized institution in Colombia. That's why we have the responsibility to interact between the different sectors to create that interaction between those sectors and try to build with them that multi-stakeholders vision regarding cyber. We got some good examples of cooperation in cyber matters between private and public sector. The first one is we make monthly meetings held by Joint Cyber Command of the military forces in coordination with the National Police that made possible the construction of a critical infrastructure list that lead the National Plan for Protection and Defense of Cyber Infrastructure. And the second one is all those agreements between private corporation and the Ministry of National Defense in the development of cyber capacities. So this is in a very short way the explanation of why the Ministry of Defense had the lead in this area.
Are there specific industries within that critical infrastructure list that you've identified as important from national and economic security perspective?
Yeah, we got two most important group of industries. The first one is financial, and the second one is electric industry.
Are there specific things that the Ministry of Defense is doing to increase their defensive posture, resilience, continuity of business plans?
Yeah, is the building together the capacity with all those approaches from critical infrastructure and a combination of efforts from police perspective and also military perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. That's interesting. Art, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in maybe 2 or 3 countries as what they're identifying as critical industries of national importance?
Sure, and it falls pretty much in line with what the group is saying here. The oil and gas, obviously energy sector probably being the primary sector. The most organizations, countries are concerned about. Obviously, if you've got no power, your country shuts down, followed secondly, I'd say, by the financial services sector. What's interesting is I tend to see the financial services sectors in most countries being more advanced when it comes to cybersecurity from both a policy and implementation of regimes around securing that information, more so than the oil and gas sector or the energy sector. So I certainly see a disconnect there where I personally see oil and gas and energy as probably the #1 infrastructure. The disconnect between the security regimes is pretty marked, and I think Joanna mentioned, and I think I tend to see this because typically most governments impose or do require, especially within the financial sector, that certain security regimes be put in place. Not necessarily do those same requirements apply to the oil and gas and energy sector. I tend to see them as more voluntary. Well, when you make something voluntary to the corporate sector, I will tell you, it isn't going to happen. If you say it's voluntary, it just isn't going to happen. Corporations are not going to spend a penny if they are not required to. So again, big disconnect there, and until there's a change in that thought process that we don't make this voluntary, we make it a requirement for critical infrastructure to implement these security regimes, we will again continue to see these failures in systems.
So I think it's a big struggle, though, as governments are looking at this as the laissez-faire. The market will heal itself, and therefore we need this to be voluntary because we've innovated our way out of this, and there are other governments who are looking at this as we have to regulate, and somewhere in between perhaps is the right answer. I have one more question for this group, and so I'd like to invite the audience to start queuing up. We have 21 minutes left of this panel, for key questions. But one of the questions that I have is, it goes along the lines of these industries that we've began to identify as critical to our national sovereignty, if you will, and our economic strength. And increasingly these industries, albeit privately held or nationally privatized, are the targets of denial, disruption, and now destructive destruction of their property. The world has gone largely silent about what's going on with the Shamoon 2 virus that's being launched against all of the critical infrastructures in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. Now, whether that's another nation state that's launching that attack or it's a proxy of a nation state launching that attack, the sovereignty of Saudi Arabia or the political instability that is causing is significant. We're seeing those other events going after these proxies of our national industries of importance that are causing alarming impacts, and so I'd like to ask each of you, is there one or two scenarios that keep you awake at night personally, or keeping your government up awake at night personally, that you're starting to look at from a national critical incident response capability of that you must be able to organize quickly to restore and create that resilience back in your infrastructure? I know for me personally, I very much am worried still about electric power because, we could live through a hurricane on this coast and an earthquake on the west coast, and it could bring down critical infrastructures for days, if not weeks. And if that was a man-made digital disaster, it could be much more long-lasting and much harder to restore. So I open the floor. Dr. Liu, do you want to start again?
Okay. I think it's a very interesting question because you mentioned about the critical infrastructure. There are a lot of the critical infrastructure because it is critical because related to a lot of people and a lot national security and economy. But you also mentioned the sovereignty, which is very controversial concept in cyberspace. A lot of people disagree with that. But if you want me to mention one area, I think it's the nuclear, because it is critical, it is important. It's not just the nuclear plant or nuclear weapon, but also the whole life circle from the raw material to the weapon to the plant. This area, we probably could make agreement, their sovereignty over there. We probably, for China, US, and Russia, made agreement that we are not attack your nuclear facilities. It is because we used to have our very good international agreement under non-proliferation, NPT, and as well as some other regulations in nuclear. So I think this area we need to pay more attention to, not just because it is critical, but also because there could be, develop some kind of the models for the other areas. Thank you.
Well, so there was malware found in the nuclear power plants in South Korea and in the nuclear power plants in Germany. And one could argue elsewhere, maybe here in the United States. So is that one of the crisis response scenarios that is most troubling in China that you're worried about?
Yeah, I think so. I think because this area is so closed, most time it's military. It's not just the civil facilities. So people are, my worry is sometimes people are overconfident about their, protection of this kind of their facilities. Sometimes they do not want, like thin CERT to get involved. Sometimes they think they are, perfect, but who knows?
There's definitely a fair amount of hubris in industry about how well their security is protecting them. Joanna, in Poland, you have many shared borders and lots of concerns over there about stability on the borders, stability of the country, and actually shared services across borders. Can you talk about maybe one or two of the scenarios that are keeping you and or your country's leaders up at night?
Of course, so from our Polish perspective, for sure the most alarming scenario would be possible cyber attack on critical infrastructure, of course. And I mean, of course, this is a global trend that we are observing, increasing number and increasing severity of these types of attacks. We know now for sure that cyber attacks can lead to physical consequences, and this is what we observed in Ukraine in December, I believe, 2015. 103 cities were shut down from the electricity because of the cyber attack, and it was seen as an element of the hybrid conflict that is taking place over there at the moment. And from our perspective, exactly hybrid conflict with the elements of cyber attacks is seen as a real threat to our national security. And therefore, we try to enhance this element of our national security. And so, of course, we have some procedures in place. There are three-level national response systems for cyber incidents. I'm not going to go into the details now. I'm open if you would like to know something more about it later on. But of course, besides of that, cybersecurity activities are also incorporated into our traditional crisis response mechanisms. So, I mean, we try to figure out how to strengthen this area because we believe that this is something that is going to be under the danger. And we do not expect to have like an open armed conflict soon, hopefully, but we are truly worried by possible hybrid elements with the use of cyber threats.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One of our colleagues had talked about that there's a quadrennial exercise that is conducted by a nearby state that traditionally has Warsaw as one of the key targets in its exercise to destabilize the Western Alliance. So we expect that quadrennial exercise to happen this summer. So hopefully it'll just be an exercise and not an actual execution of an operation. In Colombia, how are you thinking about the scenarios that are keeping you up at night? Again, you have a very different geography and neighbors.
Yeah. In Colombia, we got two crisis scenarios. The first one will involve an attack of critical infrastructure of the country. And the second scenario is the one where cybercrime can affect public databases and citizens' private information. Colombia has established cybersecurity and cyber defense mechanisms supported by national policies that have enabled to generate response and recovery capacities. There's an initiative to create a national model of incident management that will determine guidelines for coordination among the different stakeholders. Also, a national protection and defense plan, a national system has been developed for the protection of critical infrastructure, and this allow to identifying roles, responsibilities, and coordinate response, recovery, and resilience for critical infrastructures.
Wow, okay, great, thank you. Art, one scenario that keeps you up at night?
So I keep seeing, especially when we're working with critical infrastructure that get compromised, typically, and these statistics are out there, over 200 days between compromise and detection. And that chain isn't getting any smaller. My concern is that as these bad actors maintain presence in systems, the continued infiltration into, especially critical infrastructure, into industrial control systems, into potentially firmware, the implications, I think, are pretty horrific when you think of the critical infrastructure and bad actors laying persistent in these systems for many months, if not years. And this is something that we see occurring on a regular basis. And again, the disconnect, I think, is between the complexity of some of these systems and just the personnel that just don't have the education, the background experience, and training in being able to detect some of these more complex type of malware that may be persistent in systems. But on an even bigger point, and I think obviously it's more of a policy issue, Melissa, you had brought up before that trillions of dollars are being poured into technology, the Internet of Things, and there's a secondary market of security products that are right behind it. When you look at that and you think about that, the implications of that there's no other, I think, product out there, and I think of technology as a product, right? Maybe the automobile market, where you build an automobile and there's a market, secondary market behind it to secure that automobile, right? It's a policy issue that all of these great frameworks that we're talking about and all of these great international norms that we're looking at implementing, until we fix the very basics of the very technology that we're building and pushing out and selling at an amazing rate, again, these problems are going to continue to exist.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I mean, especially when I start to look at, as you said, that companies have a persistent threat in their institutions for 200 days before it's discovered. That's 200 days where I can steal the personal identifiable information, your intellectual property, I can monetize it on the market. There are other companies that have persistent malware that then can disrupt their services, and then still others that are seeing damage of their property. That cyber insecurity of these companies is a tax on our growth, and is actually affecting the GDP of our countries, and those GDP losses should be reflected in the bottom line of our digital agendas. I'm going to open up our conversation now to the audience. I'm going to take the first 3 questions, and then we'll field them from there, and then I will take the next 3 after that, please. And tell us who you are, where you're from, and we'll answer your questions. Thank you.
Hi, David Mannheim, RAND. I'm wondering, especially given the kind of international character of the panel, the international interests, and the fact that, as has been pointed out repeatedly, a lot of these issues, not for critical systems, but for most of the systems that are out there, are being built all over the world. Is there a place for not just norms in cybersecurity, but regulatory coordination, explicit treaties, explicit work between multiple countries to work on this? Does anybody have any thoughts?
Thank you. The next question, please.
Hello, I'm Alberto Cerda at Ford Foundation. The moderator did a great work in terms of pulling out more information about the role of corporate actors in your countries in developing your strategies. I want to change a little bit the perspective. I want to ask you, particularly to Alvaro. Alvaro mentioned that in developing the strategy in Colombia, you develop ultimately a multi-stakeholder process. In fact, it's a very well-known fact that you have been incorporating civil society into the conversation. And we are not talking about business associations. We are not talking about academic institutions. We are talking also about human rights groups, digital rights groups, consumers organizations, user organizations, which is a wonderful experience. I believe that you actually follow the OECD recommendations on this matter. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what is the actual contribution and what is the actual challenges that civil society engagement in this policy forum have for developing your strategy? And I would love to hear something, a little something at least from the other panelists about what is the role that civil society, again, other than academic institutions, other than business associations, has been playing in developing your own strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, please.
Hello, Suresh Krishnaswamy, George Mason University. My question was more with respect to the definition of these critical infrastructure sectors. I think the reason that we have 18 critical infrastructures here is the nature of what is perceived to be critical infrastructure. It's a problem of perception, and the fact that risk can be dependent and interdependent from a number of different sources. So my question is, rather than thinking about critical infrastructure sectors, and I like the way you actually defined the sectors without actually listing them in terms of the core service providers as well as the operators. I like that definition. So my question was, is a new way of thinking about what these critical infrastructure sectors are less a definition of the sectors and more in terms of critical capabilities? Do we want to start talking about what are the critical capabilities that we need to have that can be applied across any kind of providers of that service or operators for that service? So it's a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I start to think about critical capabilities as really, we need to stop talking about it as the infrastructures and start talking about them as the services. Because key services may actually transcend infrastructures. So we have 3 key questions. They're actually all interlinked. I'm going to go to Alberto's question first of the involvement of the private sector in your overall national strategies. To what extent have they been involved? And then what were some of the strengths of that involvement? And then what were some of the challenges associated with that involvement? As always, private sector has special interests, and we suffer from that a great deal in this country, from lobbying and other things, that maybe some of the things, the initiatives that the government would like to pursue are not necessarily going to be put on the table because of the private sector interests. But then, of course, at the end of the day, the government is completely dependent upon the private sector being able to deliver these core services. So let's start with that question, and then we'll move on. Since Alberto directed it to you, Alvaro, could you please talk a little bit first about Colombia, and then we'll go to Joanna and then Dr. Liu.
Yes, I believe in this new. When I start my presentation, I spoke about 2 different approaches regarding cyber. The first one was wanted to build capacities, and that's why it was so close to the national institution in the Ministry of Defense. That second approach is absolutely open to different stakeholders, and in that approach is critical the participation of civil society and academy in building that national capacity. We have many areas where we can interact with that civil society approach. Cyber is a matter of everyone, and it's absolutely critical to have those different approaches in that process construction.
Joanna, can you talk a little bit about the private sector and civil society, the multi-stakeholder process in Poland, and then also if you could try to address your definition of critical infrastructure versus capability?
All right. Okay, so I wish I could say that the private sector was fully engaged in the process of drafting our national cybersecurity strategy, but it wasn't a fact. I'm convinced that in the future we can engage these actors more broadly and more deeply within this process. However, I truly hope that that the private sector will be strongly engaged at the stage of implementation. And there are some signs that it's going to happen, as for example, recently our country established an entity named National Cybersecurity Center with the aim of building strong partnership with our private sector. So they're supposed to work hand in hand with our national sector in order to enhance cybersecurity. So these are good signs for that. And of course, in terms of general vision, our government is strongly committed to developing private-public partnerships and maintaining fully multi-stakeholder approach in terms of conducting particular initiatives in the area of cybersecurity. As for the critical infrastructure in Poland, I just want to say that we use the word infrastructure. However, the definition clearly says that it stands for services, systems, objects, and so this is much more than the physical objects that you might, and I know that this is the impression that you can have after hearing the word infrastructure, but this is not the case in Poland. We have service and system-oriented approach. So I mean, I believe that this is something that needs to be implemented everywhere else, because then it can make only it can have sense and lead to positive consequences. Yeah, I think I answered.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Liu, to what extent were the state-owned industries and/or private sector, how are they involved in the development of your recently launched national strategy and the like in China?
Okay, multi-stakeholder is not our concept. Chinese government at least like the most. Chinese government is more like a multilateral, which means, in the past, China has a strong government, and most of the industry are state-owned companies. But the internet is exception. In internet ICT areas, you have all these big companies are not state-owned companies. Actually, their identity is very interesting. For example, like Alibaba and Baidu, who invested by a Japanese investors and list on the United States, right? So, but they have a lot of their Chinese employees. So, I agree that the multi-stakeholder model or public-private partnership in national strategy making, that the private sector do have a strong influence, but it can be categorized at different level. For example, you have the internet companies, and Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and Huawei. They have strong, impact on that and get involved very actively. And also, you have small and medium-sized companies. The lack of the resources, lack of the awareness, so it's really hard for them to get involved. But their third category is the foreign companies like Microsoft and Oracle, Intel. Those companies, they look China as a very big market. They are also strong, involved in the decision making. They have, huge amount of the resources in China. They have lobby. They reach out to their decision maker, and even, for example, like we have the standard, the TC 260. It's the standard organization. We have 4 members from the United States. So
right.
They're different, but I believe that this is important. You have more, private sector to get involved, but more importantly, you need to have the small and the middle-sized, company to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our panel time is up, but I can't think of a better way of opening up an international conference than when having a distributed international delegation who all average flight time over here was more than 14 hours, and they're awake. They're with us. They've informed us on some really interesting things that are happening in their countries. I encourage you to engage with them through the day while they're still here in our country. And please help me welcome them and thank them for their contributions this morning for the opening of this conference. Thank you.